Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's live chat. Can you believe it's already been 7 weeks of this challenge? That's not even counting the previous chats we did before the challenge even started. Really has flown by, hasn't it? In this week's challenge, we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you some design inspiration ideas for your borders. I'll show you some other quilted examples that I've done with rulers, and then I'll answer your questions, and we'll just have a good time of it like we normally do. So this week we talked through quilting borders, and it was mostly just a design inspiration thing, a bonus video, if you will, because all the designs that we've learned so far could definitely be used in the borders. So we just kind of recapped, and then I showed you a couple of options. When it comes to quilting borders, the main thing I want you to remember is when you're picking out your designs, think of designs that can be quilted efficiently. Now, if you're just still trying to get used to the idea of quilting in general, don't worry about this. But for those of you that are a little bit more, experienced, that already have a little bit of your bad habits in place, then I know you have some experience, I like to pick designs that can be broken into chunks. So what I want to do is, instead of having to quilt one design continuously down the border, I want to be able to quilt it in sections. And so when I'm thinking through what I'm going to quilt or where I'm going to put it, I'm really trying to think, how am I going to transition my way through this quilt? Now, if I'm working on a long arm, that's important because I'm working very in a linear fashion, right? So I could quilt part of my border, the middle, and then the next part of my border. On a sewing machine, you have a little bit more options. So I could quilt just the whole border and then come to the center, or I can break it up. But it's just nice having that option so that I don't have to, change threads or break threads or start a new line of quilting. Now, again, this is just my preference. You can definitely do what you think looks good. So let's look at some pictures of the designs we talked about this week. And this one right here, the cutouts in the dark blue border with our ruler. We already saw this when we did the cutouts, but it's a great example of using your design in a directional fashion to fill in your border, right? So if you remember, if we're doing a meander, it's just going all different directions. But if we want to put it in a border, we want it to follow a certain layout to really enhance that. Now, when we're quilting with cutouts, those types of rulers tend to be smaller. I mean, there are some bigger cutout rulers, but for the most part, they make a smaller shape. So if I have a larger border, I can quilt multiple rows. Or I also showed an example where I was quilting it so that it kind of meandered throughout the area. You can take it and really apply it to the area that you have to work with. And then in the light blue border, if it's a little bit hard to see, but what we talked about was just changing the direction just a bit to give it a different look. So we've already seen how to do that with our borders. So let's talk about the Taj. So we saw Taj a lot in this challenge, just because it has knocked so many things off the list, right? It's a cutout, it's a pointy, it's a curvy. But this particular example shows how we can take a ruler that's a little bit bigger and make the quilting more dense. And that was a good question that got brought up, was about the density of the quilting. So we'll address that here in just a second. But if you want the quilting to be a little bit more dense, you can overlap your designs. So very helpful no matter what shape you're using, or even if you're not using a ruler and you're just doing free motion, still being able to overlap is really a nice option. Now, I want to talk about the corner here, because when it comes to borders, it's not so much the design itself, it's turning the corner. And so I've tried to give you a bunch of different options or things to think about. In this example, I've turned the corner with more of a motif. So I've aimed for that inner corner, I'm making sure that it's getting kind of close, and then I'm just quilting a motif and then moving on. However, we don't have to do that. We can definitely do some different things, and I'll show you some examples here in a second, but just a good example of putting something a little bit fancier in that corner. All right, now the Starburst design is a cutout. We saw this as well, but I just want to kind of recap that when we're turning the corner, there's a couple different ways you can do it. And in this particular example, I'm imagining that there is that line from the inner border corner to the outer border corner. And as soon as the design hits it, it changes direction. And this is going to help it turn that corner at the right spot. And even though the Starburst itself was kind of small, I was able to fill in that larger border by adding multiple rows. Now, if this is a design that you're going to try, or a variation of this, no matter what cutout you're using, remember, offsetting them will help you get them closer together. So if you want it still to be kind of dense, making those shapes offset each other so it can get a little closer is a nice option, but definitely not necessary. It really just depends on what you want to do. And this is that same border design. I meant to take that out, and I didn't. But how about this one? I didn't demonstrate this, but I think it's pretty easy to see how it goes together. It's the Curvy ruler. It's just a pretty little scallop that goes around the border. And I know we've already seen this in our live chat, but just want to show you, you don't have to turn every corner. Just because there's 4 of them there doesn't mean you have to do them all. So here I just did 2 halves of it, and I think it's pretty cute. Echoing is your best quilting friend. You know this. We've talked about this a lot. Echoing is going to help you fill in those larger areas, so those bigger borders or those spaces that aren't quite right for the shape of your ruler. And so here I've added a scallop and then echoed around it. And I could have kept echoing it if I had more room, but I was good with that and just moved on. Okay, so turning the corner here, this example shows you some big kind of continuous curve, but again, that motif in the corner, it's a slightly different shape because I used a different ruler for that. And it just goes to show that the shape of the ruler can give you some different variations, even if you're doing the same design. This is why maybe some of your quilting might look a little different than mine. Maybe your ruler wasn't quite the same shape or used a different part of it. But the idea is I'm turning that corner and then moving on. If you have questions about the borders, there's a whole borders and backgrounds free motion challenge, and I talk a lot about turning the corners and how to transition in and out. It's no different when you're working with rulers. It's just an additional thing to think about. My favorite thing to do though when turning the corners is just to quilt a completely different design in the corner. It just makes it a little bit easier to think through. This is I think it's fun, and it's funny whenever I would quilt for customers back in the day, I would say things like, oh, I didn't charge you extra for that little custom bit of quilting, even though I know that it's a little bit easier for me, but you know, they don't need to know that. When you're putting something different in the border corner, you can make it similar, you can make it different. In the video, this week's video, I did the same kind of thing in the corner with the piano keys, but here I did something completely different. So I quilted my arcs and I added that little square shape echoing into the inside. And if you notice, once I got to the inside, I just quilted my way right out to the edge and moved on to the next area. So a little bit of a cheat there, but I think it really adds a lovely juxtaposition to the quilting. I don't know, I'm just making that up, but you know, it works, so it's fine. Now, this will rarely happen, but every once in a while, a bright, shiny thing will happen and the design will fit perfectly in the border corner. How awesome is that? This was kind of a happy accident, so I'm like, I'm definitely going to include this. Sometimes you don't have to turn the corner. It just repeats perfectly. It won't happen like that very often. I mean, at least it doesn't for me, especially even if it should fit perfectly. By the time I get to that point, I'm probably off a little bit because my quilting isn't quite perfect. So, but if the design fits just perfectly in that corner, then all the better. You don't have to worry too much about turning it. And this was the piano key design that we learned in this lesson. I was kind of conflicted as what designs to kind of talk about. And I really love the piano key because it's just a basic design, but it's still impactful. So in the video, I talked about, you know, how you can vary the spacing. In here, I quilted some lines closer and further and closer and further. But the trick to this is that you want there to be enough difference in the spacing that it looks intentional, right? So I want those lines closer together to be like 1/4 of an inch, and the further ones apart to be like 3/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch. Having enough contrast in that distance or that spacing will make it look intentional, and it was intentional. But what's not fun is when it was intentional but it looks like a mistake. So it will just help keep it from being a mistake. Another great thing about piano keys is I don't have to worry so much about hitting that inner corner because my lines are only about 3/4 of an inch apart. So, and that's the widest one. So even if I get to the end and I have to put 2 skinny close to each other, or that last one is a little bit bigger or smaller, it's not going to be super noticeable because I'm already dealing with a small space. So really nice design if I don't want to think too much about it. And also, if there's some element to the center of the quilt that I want to show off, like maybe it's a strip quilt and I can continue those lines out into the border. So I'm going to use the inside of the quilt also to help me think about what spacing I should use. In general though, it's about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. It's usually what I use. And I don't know, I didn't talk about this in the video, but when I was demonstrating this real quickly on my long arm, I didn't know if anybody noticed that I'm not repositioning the rulers for those travel lines. So even though we're using straight rulers to help me get those straight-ish lines, I'm not using them for every straight line. When I was doing my little horizontal traveling, which is only about 1/4 of an inch or 3/4 of an inch, depending on which one, it would take a lot longer to turn the ruler than it would to actually quilt it. So I'm just freehand quilting those without the ruler, but leaving the ruler in that vertical position. So it's just a little bit more of an efficient way to quilt. And that's the same on a sewing machine. It's actually a little bit easier for me to freehand those straightish lines when they're short on a sewing machine. But you could definitely rotate your ruler if you wanted, that's up to you, but just a fun fact there. Just a fun FYI. Okay, so at the end of my normal classes or when I'm teaching live, I usually have kind of like next steps, or where I show off just a little bit, to show you what you can do with the designs. And it was really great because the question that came up was how much do I use rulers and how much do I just wing it? So free motion quilting to ruler quilting, what's the ratio? And Mary Jean said, well, it seems like before I was much more freeform, but now I use rulers a little bit more. So I thought that was a great question to kind of end the slideshow portion with. So when it comes to using rulers, or the ratio of rulers to free motion, it totally depends on the quilt. You know, it seems like sometimes maybe I get into a phase where I use a lot more rulers and sometimes I don't. It just really kind of depends on what's going on at the time. But for the most part, I love to use rulers and free motion interchangeably. I love to change it up just because it makes it a little bit more interesting. And I love quilting with rulers, but it's slower than doing free motion. And so sometimes I don't want to take my time. I want to just turn on my music real loud and I just want to quilt some swirls. Other times, you know, I'm feeling more methodical, so it really depends. But here's some examples. I just kind of went through my pictures real quick and threw a couple in here. So this is a quilt I did for Tula for her Holiday Homies collection several years ago. But if you look in the center, there's that square spiral design that we talked about and we learned way back in the beginning of this challenge. And it's a perfect example of just doing a couple echoes and then using filler in there. So again, switching between the two interchangeably. So I'm going to pause real quick. That's why I leave my ruler foot on my sewing machine all the time, so that I don't have to switch that out. And that's also why I leave my ruler base on my long arm all the time. I don't ever take it off, I just leave it on. Some people complain on the long arm, but it adds a little bit of like a drag to it, but it doesn't give me any trouble, so I always keep it on there. Then if we look in the sashing around that block, there's more straight lines, and it's, you know, looks really intricate. It's just dot to dot quilting with some free motion in there. So again, switching back and forth to really make those lines pop. I will say when it comes to using rulers, I use a straight edge ruler most of the time. So when it comes to like the Shelleys and the Tajes, I use those, but not as often. Usually just as pops on a quilt or in particular areas, but a straight edge, I mean, I'm stitching in the ditch with it, I'm smoothing it out on my long arm, I'm quilting my diagonal lines, so it's the one I reach for the most. And that's why I always say, if you only get one ruler, get a good straight edge ruler, you're gonna get the most out of it. So this would be an example of using that straight edge ruler. But I did kind of go through my design or pictures and found other quilts that I've used rulers with. And so this one was for Allison Glass. It's called Cathedral. Now, when I'm trying to decide what to use a ruler for and what not to, it really depends on how comfortable I am quilting that certain shape. So I'm comfortable with echoing, I'm comfortable with swirls. I don't use a wavy line ruler too much, or a wavy ruler, because I'm fine with just winging waves. But here on this quilt, I'm gonna get a little closer. I knew I wanted to do some arcs. I wanted these arcs to kind of connect, and it was really important that they're all pretty symmetrical because they're gonna eventually come together and make that secondary pattern around the whole quilt. So that's an example of when I would use an arc ruler. Now, if this were just one block, or if it was a busier fabric, or it wasn't in this arrangement where it would really be noticeable, I might freehand that. But for this particular time, I knew I wanted it to be the same each time, and so it was important for me to use a ruler. So that would be an example of using part of my arc ruler to kind of connect those lines, and even doing some of those echoing. But when I got inside those print fabrics or those little strips, that's just freehand because, you know, it's not as difficult for me to freehand that curve right there as it is that longer arc. I really hope that made sense. I feel like sometimes I talk too much, but you know, it is what it is. So if I want the quilting to be very precise, if it's creating a secondary pattern or it's very noticeable, arcs are what I would use. The tricky thing when quilting arcs and circles and curves is that it really needs to be symmetrical, and it's hard to keep it symmetrical. I'm sure you've noticed one side looks fine and the other side not so fine. So If I want the design to be symmetrical, I'm really particular about the rulers. Sometimes that maybe I want to put it in as a background fill, and so this is using my Chevy ruler as a background filler. In this particular example, again, I wanted it to be a consistent shape. I can freehand this kind of stair step idea, but to keep that spacing consistent and to keep it almost, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but close enough, right? Keep it same throughout the quilt, I'll definitely use a ruler for that. So again, just if I want that symmetry, that consistency, if I'm not too worried about the consistency, I'm going to freehand it. So, okay, I don't have a great flat picture of this quilt, but this was one from back from the day in the Midnight Quilt Show, and another example of using rulers. I don't even remember the name of the quilt, but it's one of my favorites. It's hanging up in the other room right now, and I use the clamshell and the straight edge. So clamshell ruler, this one was multi-clam, I think. Multi-clam, I don't think I had Shelly at the time, and straight edge rulers. So using those two contrasting shapes to show off the warm and the cool. So in the warmer colors, I did the curvy, and in the cooler colors, I did the straight line. And here we have a little bit closer picture of it. So I love making the quilting look like it's running into something or behind something. So it just gave me a good defined edge to quilt that design. I want to show you one little place. It's hard to see, but if you look close, on the right hand side, about just under halfway, almost like 2/3, you can see like half of a wishbone in that area. So in that clamshell, there's a wishbone. The reason was when I was connecting them, I was on the wrong side of where I needed to be. So I just filled it with wishbones to get to the other side. So if you're not where you need to be, just add some more quilting to get to the next one. That was a great question that came up on the chat. Somebody said that they tried to hide a bad clamshell or a trouble clamshell with pebbles, and now it's really noticeable. What should you do? And I said, well, put some pebbles in other areas to kind of distract from that. But then Susan suggested maybe putting applique over it would do the trick. That was one of her go-to tricks. And I'm like, that's a really good idea. So there's always that option. Well, that is kind of the end of the picture portion of that, but hopefully it gives you some ideas of how to use different rulers and also how to apply them to your borders. When you're quilting borders, sometimes it's funny because people are all different, and sometimes some people do better with borders because it's more of a defined area. They have a clear set kind of space to fill in, whereas other people are like, don't tell me what to do. It just overwhelms me to have to think about filling in this border. So hopefully if you are on the first side of that, you could look to borders as a way to kind of get comfortable with the design. If you're on the latter side, then maybe learning the design before you start applying it to a border. Again, it just really depends on everybody. I like to joke that it's always fun teaching classes because everybody is so different. So I try to, not lump people into groups, but to help give you things to think about for your personality and your style. Okay, so questions. So I have a few questions that I wrote down, so I'll address those, and then I'll pop back over to the chat and see if there's any questions in there that I can answer real quick. Okay, so a lot of questions about getting the long arm into the groove of the Sid ruler. So Sid, I went to grab one, but my rulers are everywhere, has a cutout portion that doesn't have a little notch that you can get in. So on my long arm, my foot will actually come up. I have a handy quilter, and it will raise up just a bit so I can slide it under. So I raise the needle in the up position, of course, lift it up and put it in there and drop it in. I think that some long arms don't have that capability, and so that is definitely a design flaw on my end. I was just kind of assuming they all did because mine did. So if that's the case, you can't use the cutout, but you can definitely use the outside and the curvy. There was also another great question about, like, for stitching in the ditch, which one's better, Slim or Sid? And I was like, oh, that's like asking to pick favorite children. We all know that the child is my favorite is the one I'm with at that point, right? So Sid is really good for stitching in the ditch if you're all about like the perfection of it, or you want a good multi-purpose ruler because it does have those curves and the cutouts. But that being said, I reach for Slim most of the time just because, I don't worry too much. I don't need the extensions as much because I know how to hide my bad quilting mistakes. And so I just reach for Slim. Again, it just depends. It really depends on what you like. So this was a great question that came up that wasn't actually specific to the challenge, but I realized that maybe if I talked through it a little bit more, it might make more sense. So somebody says, does the size of the design change the effect of it, right? So I'm assuming in this question, like if I quilt a swirl this small, or I quilt a swirl this big, am I going to get a different effect? And the short answer is no. If you're using consistency, like all your designs are the same size, you're still going to get that same effect. It's when you start using different sizes next to each other that you make something pop out, you make something hide, that kind of thing. So when it comes to what size to quilt your quilting, it's just based on how much density you want in your quilt. How dense do you want the quilting? I like to quilt things to death and then quilt a little bit more on it. Some people don't want as much quilting. So the same design, everything equal, in like one size or the other is going to still have the same effect. So if you want a curvy, swirly design, it's not going to matter if you quilt them all this big or this big. You're still going to get generally the same effect. Now, at a certain point, like you quilt them very, very small or very, very big, you're going to get a different thing. But I'm just talking about a range, the kind of normal range of quilting designs. So that obviously led to the question, what about the stiffness of a quilt? And so somebody mentioned it was great. For bed quilts, I tend to make them less dense. For wall hangings, I make them more dense. It gives it a different stiffness. Perfect. That's exactly, what I would think. But I will just give one caveat. If you use a natural fiber batting, you can get away with more dense quilting because it will still have a nice drape. So when I think about making quilts for my nephew, who's younger, I'm like, I'm going to quilt the heck out of that thing because he's hopefully going to love it and drag it everywhere and use it. And it will soften up with, use, but also using a natural fiber like cotton or bamboo or something like that will still give it a nice drape without making it stiff and still getting to add as much quilting as I want. But again, like everything else, this is a personal preference, completely up to you. So I know it's funny because I'm like, every time I say that, it's up to you. I'm sure there's people like, if I knew what I wanted, I wouldn't be watching this right now. But I'm just trying to tell you there's no wrong answer. You can do what you like. So try something. Do you like it? Great. If you don't, move on, try something else. So, all right. Great question that came up about combining clamshells with waves. So last week, week 6, we learned the Curvy rulers and we talked about clamshells and waves, which is so much fun. I mean, I really love that effect. But the question was, do you need to break thread in between the designs? And the answer is no. You can go right from one right to the next if you happen to be in the right position. Now, it's funny because I was doing a little demo at the shop on the long arm and I was talking about breaking thread. And whoever I was demoing it for, said, I've never heard it called breaking thread. It seems so aggressive. And I'm like, well, I guess it does. I'm not like just breaking it, but I'm not stopping a line of quilting and starting a new one. Now, there are those times that I'm not in the right spot, right? Maybe I need to be over here and I'm over there. In that instance, I might break thread and start a new line of quilting, or I might add another echo to get over there, or I might travel to get over there. It just really depends. So good question. You don't have to break thread. That's why leaving my ruler on all the time, or my ruler foot on all the time, means I can switch back and forth, no problem. Okay, so SW said, this is great, the challenge is awesome, but the hardest part is picking designs for the quilt. Well, that is true. And I wish I could say that there's going to come a day where you'll look at every quilt and instantly know the perfect design to put on there. Probably not going to happen. I still haven't hit that point yet, but I will say the more you quilt, the easier it gets, because the more you can imagine what it's going to look like before you start, because you have experience with it. The follow-up comment was, I don't want the quilting to take away from the quilt top. Like, so you've made this quilt top. It took forever, and now I'm asking you to do ruler quilting all over it. I know how that can be a little scary. But the fact of the matter is, it needs to be quilted or it's not a quilt. I mean, it's fine if you don't want to quilt it. You can frame it. But if it's going to be a quilt, it needs to be quilted somehow. So when you're looking at that beautiful quilt top and you're like, oh, it's so graphic, it's so linear, and the quilting is going to soften it up, possibly. But it needs to be quilted. It's not a quilt until it's quilted, right? Notice, it doesn't say it's not a quilt until it's bound. Binding is optional. I like the raw edge quilt myself, but I know some of you like hand binding, so it's totally fine. Anyway, the more you quilt, the easier it will be to pick out designs. The more you'll learn what you do and don't like, right? So I'm sure if you've been quilting along through any of the challenges, you got to the end of a section and you're like, I now know I don't like that design, and I don't like quilting it, and I don't like how it looks, and I'll never do it again. Perfect. Now you've learned a little bit more and you're just kind of refining that process. I have experience picking designs because I used to quilt for customers, and that was really good for me because I got to quilt quilts that I would never make for good or bad. Like quilts that I'm like, I will never take the time to do needle turn applique like that, but now I get to quilt it and get experience with it. Or there were times that I was like, I would never make that quilt, but now I'm still going to quilt it. So the more practice you get, the better. And I know it's difficult when you're just quilting your own quilts, but I promise the easier it gets. I will say, like, to like sum it up, if you look at your quilt and you think, what's the most important thing about the quilt? What is it? And how can I use the quilting to highlight it? That would be the starting point. Is it the fabric? Is it the piecing? Is it the, the story behind it? And in the Help How Do I Quilt It challenge, we talk a little bit about that, because once you know where to put the focus, then it's a little easier to pick designs. So like, for instance, when I'm working with Tula, who's really the only person I quilt for anymore, she'll say, I really want this effect to come out. I really want this fabric to pop. And that gives me a direction. And then I can pick designs that will do that. So hopefully that helps. But again, it depends on you. Yes, Mary Jean, raw edge quilt, it's not really a thing, but it could be a thing. Don't you think? Like, I want to start a movement. The raw edge quilt, why should the batting be smothered and oppressed? I think the batting should be seen. I'm only half serious, of course. A quilt should be bound if it's going to be used, but for my quilt samples or trunk shows or stuff that are just examples, a lot of them aren't bound. It's almost embarrassing. But anyway, Gloria said, I bought all the rulers, but I keep drifting back to free motion quilting. I need to get back on that, or kind of like sounded like stay focused. I think you do what you want to do, right? Maybe you got through this challenge and you're like, I know that I don't want to do rulers, and that's great. Not every design is for everybody. Not every quilt, every ruler is for everybody. So don't be hard on yourself. This is our hobby and this is our fun time, our therapy, our passion. So let's not be hard on ourselves about it. Let's just do what we want to do and have fun with it. So if you bought the rulers, put them aside. I'm sure you'll pull them out later on. Just do any free motion with it. And then the last thing I'll sum up with, and then we'll kind of look through and wrap this thing up. It's important to practice free motion quilting if you want to get better. It's important to practice any creative endeavor if you want to get better. That's what makes it fun, I think. And I know when I say that, people are like, ugh, I don't like practicing. I kind of like learning new things. I don't mind looking stupid. I don't mind not knowing it. I take it almost as a challenge. But sometimes it can be hard to know what to practice, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna devote 20 minutes to this and I'm gonna try it out, but what should I do? Well, that's exactly why I started the free motion challenge quilting alongs. It's almost like having like a workout partner or somebody say, okay, now try this and try that, with the ability to like say, no, I'm gonna skip that or try a different one. So it doesn't matter what you practice, just practice will make you better. Consistency is key. Like, we get better at what we consistently do. So I'll just leave it at that. Speaking of challenges, so this officially wraps up this challenge, which is just nuts. All the planning and the design and the sourcing of the fabric and the cutting and the cutting and the cutting. Oh my gosh, my crew cut so much fabric. They're amazing. And then to do the videos and then get to this point, it's almost kind of like, oh. But you don't have to be sad, because there will be more challenges. I'll keep doing these because I really enjoy them. I love teaching, and I'm not going anywhere right now, so this still allows me to teach. Look forward to the next challenge early next year. I've kind of got it in my head somewhat like January-ish, February. We'll see. Don't hold me to that, but that's just kind of what's going in my head. And tentatively, this is not like official, but I think I'm going to do something that's going to be like flora and foliage. Like, so flowers, leaves, wood grain designs. So leave somewhat the ruler behind and let's do the opposite. Let's do some curvy fluid designs. And especially this one was really inspired by how many questions get asked about the wood grain design. So there's a lot of fun variations we can do with the wood grain, and it's a beautiful design. So we'll see about doing that. But even though the challenge is over, I'm still going to have live chats because this is really fun. I love popping on 30 minutes before and we talk and I answer questions. So next week, next Thursday, which is the 19th, same bat time, same bat channel, or should I say same quilt time, same quilt channel. I'll be doing another live chat about threads. So I'll talk about like what kinds of threads. Do you have to match threads? Do you have to match weight? Do you have to match type? Short answer is no, but I'll show you some quilted examples and give you some suggestions on what to think about, because it's hard enough to pick what to quilt on your quilt. Then you have to pick what kind of thread and then what color. Just a lot of choices, but we'll kind of demystify that and help talk through it. And weekly chats have had weekly giveaways, but this last week there was a error with the link, so there were no giveaway entries, so I don't have a giveaway this time, but I have it fixed and I have the next giveaway lined up, and it's going to be a quilt kit from the first episode of the Midnight Quilter. So thank you to everybody who watched the Midnight Quilter. That was really nerve-wracking. I was so nervous the night before I posted it because I'm like, oh, here we go. But the response was phenomenal, and I appreciate everybody that watched it and commented and encouraged me on it. So I hope you like it. And I promise they're going to get even better because I got a lot more practice with filming and all that stuff as we went on. So the next episode will be out next Wednesday. Okay, so the giveaway, to enter the giveaway for the kit, there's a link in the description box. So as soon as this video is over, you can go check out the description box. There'll be a link to the giveaway, also a link to the next chat, so you can set a reminder if you want, but I'll also send out an email, and so you can check it out that way. Looking forward to talking about threads and, leaving rulers behind a little bit. Anyway, I'm going to just browse through real quick. Lots of thank yous. So glad that you guys are here. I thank you for supporting me. I'll keep doing these as long as people are watching, so definitely fun. All right, so if you had a question I didn't answer, leave it in the comments after the video, after the chat's over. I go through the comments about once a week, and I try to answer as many as I can. It's like a contest. I try to see how many I can answer in 45 minutes. I'm getting pretty fast at the typing, so that's good. So definitely leave a question, or you can join the free Facebook Free Motion Challenge group. So that's a great place to post pictures, show me what you're doing, show me your examples. Love to see that as well. So thank you so much for joining me for this really fun journey. I look forward to moving on and having an even better time next year with a new challenge. So I will see you next week where we'll talk about threads, and I hope you have a great and happy rest of your week. Bye-bye.